The ocean has a unique way of keeping secrets. For centuries, it has swallowed ships, civilizations, and treasures, leaving behind nothing but an empty blue horizon. In the modern world, we like to believe we have conquered this wilderness, but, truly, we have not. We build floating fortresses of steel and glass, massive vessels weighing over 100,000 tons, powered by engines that could light up entire cities. Inside these mega cruise ships, the dark reality of the sea is completely masked. There are neon lights, crowded casinos, Broadway-style theaters, water parks, and five-star restaurants, all of which serve to distract us from the power of the ocean. When you walk down the carpeted hallways of a luxury cruise liner, surrounded by more than 3,000 passengers and crew members, you feel truly safe. You are inside a closed ecosystem, a vacation paradise where every single square inch is supposedly monitored, cleaned, and controlled. But this feeling of absolute security is, in reality, nothing more than an illusion. In the early morning hours of July 5, 2005, while a massive luxury ship named the Brilliance of the Seas was cutting through the pitch-black waters of the Mediterranean Sea, a young man named George Smith IV walked back to his cabin, remembering, perhaps, the joy of his recent wedding. He was, truly, a lucky man, 26 years old, athletic, deeply in love, and celebrating his honeymoon. He was, just hours before, surrounded by thousands of people, but now, somehow, he was alone. Yet, somewhere between the casino, the open deck, and his private balcony, George completely vanished. He did not leave the ship at a port, and he did not check out. It was as if he had never existed. When the sun rose over the coast of Turkey, his cabin door was locked from the inside, a haunting sign that something was terribly wrong. His passport, his wallet, his cash, and his clothes were exactly where he had left them, but George was gone. No one saw him fall. No one heard a scream that alerted the ship. He simply evaporated into the night. How does a human being disappear without a trace from a floating city? To understand the chilling reality of what happened to George Smith, and to understand how 20 to 25 people vanish from cruise ships every single year, we have to look past the bright neon lights and step into the legal, geographical, and psychological black hole of the open ocean. A place where the rules of land do not apply, and the unknown can be, truly, terrifying. To fully grasp the magnitude of this mystery, we must first look at who George Smith was. George was a vibrant, successful young man from Connecticut, and he had recently married the love of his life, Jennifer Hagel, a beautiful teacher. Their wedding had been a picturesque celebration, a joyful start to their new life together, and the cruise was meant to be the ultimate capstone to this beginning. They chose a luxurious 12-day Mediterranean cruise that would take them through Italy, Greece, and Turkey. It was a dream itinerary on one of the most sophisticated ships of the era, owned by Royal Caribbean. For the first few days of the voyage, George and Jennifer lived the perfect honeymoon, but as the ship departed from Greece and began its long overnight transit toward Kusadasi, Turkey, the dream slowly began to fracture. The night of July 4, 2005, started like any other festive evening on a cruise. It was summer, the weather was warm, and the ship's casino was packed. George and Jennifer spent a significant portion of the night there, drinking, gambling, and socializing. And as the night progressed, they became acquainted with a group of young men traveling on the ship, later identified as American Russians in their early 20s. Alcohol was flowing heavily, and on a cruise ship, the availability of alcohol is endless, encouraging people to lower their guards and creating a psychological state where normal boundaries of caution melt away. Your room is just an elevator ride away, a fact that can make one feel, somehow, invincible. Witnesses would later report that as the clock ticked past midnight, George was heavily intoxicated. He had, truly, had too much to drink. Jennifer, too, had consumed a massive amount of alcohol, and it was then that the evening began to take a darker turn. By 2 in the morning, the sequence of events began to blur as the night wore on, and the details became increasingly hazy. According to crew members and surveillance footage, Jennifer left the discotheque before George, escorted by casino employees who noticed she was, truly, highly impaired. In a bizarre twist, Jennifer did not end up back in her cabin immediately. Instead, she was found asleep in a corridor on an entirely different deck by a crew member who assisted her back to her room later. During those critical hours, George was left alone with his new companions, and he remained in the bar area, gambling away hundreds of dollars, seemingly energized by the high-stakes environment. Around 2:30 in the morning, George finally decided it was time to head back to cabin 9062, the balcony stateroom he shared with his wife, a room that would, later, become a focal point in the investigation. The group of young men accompanied him down the long, quiet hallways of Deck 9, a journey that was, undoubtedly, a pivotal moment in the events that unfolded. The hallways of a cruise ship late at night are, indeed, eerie places. The carpets muffle the sound of footsteps, and the low, constant hum of the engines vibrates through the walls, creating a white noise that drowns out soft sounds. Surveillance cameras cover the main elevator banks, but due to privacy concerns, the actual corridors leading to individual cabins are often blind spots, a fact that would, later, prove to be significant. This was exactly the case on Deck 9. The cameras saw George and the young men walk into the corridor, but they did not see what happened outside the door of the cabin, leaving a, somewhat, disturbing gap in the timeline. According to the statements later given by the young men, they helped a highly intoxicated George back to his room. They claimed George invited them in for a drink, and they hung out for a brief period. However, what happened inside that room remains a matter of intense dispute. The men claimed George was so drunk that he passed out, and seeing that Jennifer was not there, they decided to leave him to rest around 3 in the morning. But the physical evidence and the testimony of the neighbors tell a drastically different story, one that would, ultimately, raise more questions than answers. In cabin 9064, right next door, was a vacationing family. The walls separating cruise ship cabins are, surprisingly, thin. At approximately 3:15 in the morning, the passenger next door was awakened by loud, aggressive noises coming through the wall, and he was, understandably, disturbed. He described hearing arguments, heavy footsteps, and a loud, metallic thud, as if a heavy object had slammed against the floor or the wall. The neighbor was so disturbed that he called the guest services desk to complain about a domestic disturbance. A lone security guard arrived at the hallway, but the noise had subsided. The guard knocked, heard nothing, and assumed the situation had resolved itself, a decision that would, later, prove to be misguided. He walked away. It was, truly, a fatal mistake. The true horror began to unveil itself when the sun rose over the Mediterranean, and the darkness of the night gave way to a new, terrifying reality. At around 4 in the morning, a passenger on a lower deck stepped out onto his private balcony and noticed something strange on the canopy structure of Deck 7, a wide, metal overhang designed to protect lifeboats. Under the dim morning light, there was a massive, dark red stain, and it was, unmistakably, blood. The passenger immediately notified the ship's authorities. When the ship's security team climbed out onto the canopy of Deck 7, they realized the pool of blood aligned perfectly with cabin 9062 on Deck 9. They rushed to the room and bypassed the lock with a master key card. The room was in disarray, and a sense of chaos hung in the air. Jennifer was asleep in the bed, completely unaware of the chaos, a stark contrast to the turmoil that had, apparently, unfolded. She had been brought back to the room by a crew member later in the morning, completely unconscious from alcohol, and had not noticed her husband's absence. George was nowhere to be found, and the search for him was, sadly, about to begin. When investigators stepped out onto the private balcony, the scene became, truly, terrifying. On the railing of cabin 9062, there was blood, and it was a sight that would haunt them. More blood was found smeared along the white outer fiberglass hull of the ship, stretching down toward Deck 7. The trajectory was clear. George Smith had gone over the railing. He had fallen multiple stories, struck the metal canopy of Deck 7 with immense force, and had then slid off the edge, plunging into the dark, churning waters of the Mediterranean Sea. The immediate reaction of the cruise line became one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case, and it was a reaction that would have far-reaching consequences. A cruise ship is owned by a massive corporation, registered in a foreign tax haven, and staffed by an international crew, so it was, perhaps, not surprising that their priorities were divided. When a potential homicide occurs on land, police immediately cordon off the area. But a cruise ship is a business that relies on a tight schedule. It must dock, discharge passengers, clean rooms, and prepare for the next wave of tourists. According to the Smith family, Royal Caribbean's initial response focused heavily on damage control and maintaining the schedule, a decision that would, ultimately, raise many questions. The Turkish authorities were notified when the ship docked in Kusadasi, but their jurisdiction was limited. They could only do so much. The incident had occurred in international waters, hours before entering Turkish territory. Turkish police boarded the vessel, took photographs, and interviewed some people, but they did not have the authority to seize the ship. Meanwhile, the ship's crew began cleaning the blood from the canopy and the balcony, citing health and sanitation regulations, a move that, to the family of George Smith, was nothing short of devastating. This was, to them, the destruction of a crime scene. Crucial DNA evidence, footprints, fingerprints, and fabric fibers were washed away into the ocean, lost forever, before federal investigators could even board the ship. Because George Smith was an American citizen and the cruise line operated out of American ports, the FBI eventually stepped in. But by the time agents accessed the ship, days had passed, and the situation had changed dramatically. The vessel had already moved on to other ports. Thousands of new passengers had walked the hallways, and the physical scene had been, fundamentally, altered. Despite these challenges, the FBI began a multi-year investigation, which would, ultimately, be a long and complex process. The investigation centered on the group of young men last seen with George, and it was here that the FBI would focus their attention. Investigators uncovered that these men had behaved strangely after leaving the room, and this behavior would later become a key part of the investigation. Furthermore, the FBI discovered a video recording taken by the men later that morning, a recording that would prove to be, potentially, a crucial piece of evidence. In this recording, the young men reportedly made callous jokes about George falling over the balcony, laughing about how he was gone, and this lack of empathy was, to the family, deeply disturbing. The men maintained, through their lawyers, that the video was just tasteless, dark humor from shocked and intoxicated individuals who had nothing to do with George's death. But this explanation would not, ultimately, be convincing to everyone. As the FBI dug deeper, they ran into a technical wall regarding the electronic lock on the door of cabin 9062. Every time a card is slid, an internal computer chip logs the exact second, the card number, and whether the door was opened from the outside or inside, a system that was, in theory, foolproof. When investigators pulled the log, the data showed a paradox that would be difficult to explain. The log confirmed that Jennifer's card was used to enter the room late that morning, as well as the security team's entry, but it did not show any unknown cards entering or leaving the room during the critical hours between 3 and 4 in the morning, a period of time that was, obviously, crucial to the investigation. However, federal investigators and independent specialists offered a far more sinister explanation. They pointed out that electronic locks only log when someone enters from the hallway using a card, and this was a crucial detail. If the young men were already inside the room, they wouldn't need a card to leave. They could simply press the handle and walk out, registering as an internal exit. More terrifyingly, investigators looked at the layout of the balconies, and what they found was alarming. On the brilliance of the seas, the balconies of adjacent cabins are separated only by a thin, frosted glass partition, a partition that can be easily scaled by an agile person. It was, truly, entirely possible for someone to enter George's cabin, engage in a violent struggle, push him over the balcony, and then exit by climbing over the balcony partition into an empty adjacent room, a room not covered by cameras. The case of George Smith became a national sensation, sparking congressional hearings about safety, crime, and accountability on cruise ships. The statistics brought to light were shocking and, frankly, disturbing to the general public. Most people assume that if you are on a cruise ship, you are under the watchful eye of a captain who possesses total authority to protect you. But this is not entirely accurate. In reality, a cruise ship in international waters operates in a legal vacuum, a situation that is, admittedly, quite complex. When a ship is more than 12 nautical miles away from any coast, the primary law that applies is the law of the flag state, the country where the ship is registered. For financial reasons, almost all major cruise lines register their vessels in developing nations, countries like Panama, Liberia, or the Bahamas. This practice, known as using a flag of convenience, allows corporations to avoid stringent labor laws, high taxes, and strict regulatory oversight. But it also has some serious consequences. But it also means that if a murder occurs on board, the primary police force responsible for investigating it belongs to a small island nation, a nation that is, often, thousands of miles away, which often lacks the resources or political will to prosecute a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Despite the new laws and the intense FBI investigation, the case of George Smith slowly ground to a halt, leaving many questions unanswered. Due to the contamination of the crime scene, the lack of immediate forensic preservation, and the ambiguity of the electronic lock logs, prosecutors realized they did not have enough evidence to secure a conviction. No one was ever arrested or charged. In 2015, the FBI officially closed its investigation, leaving the case permanently unsolved. George's body was never found, and the Mediterranean Sea had swept away any physical trace of him within minutes of his plunge. It was, truly, a tragic end. The tragedy of George Smith is part of a silent, recurring pattern. To understand how systemic this issue is, one only has to look at another chilling case that occurred in 2011, involving a 24-year-old British woman named Rebecca Coriam. Rebecca was working as a youth counselor on the Disney Wonder, a job that, by all accounts, she loved. On March 22, 2011, while the ship was sailing off the coast of Mexico, Rebecca failed to show up for her morning shift. Her private belongings were untouched in her cabin, a sign that something was terribly wrong. When the crew checked the closed-circuit television cameras, they found a deeply unsettling piece of footage. At around 5:45 in the morning, Rebecca was captured on an internal ship phone, wearing oversized men's clothing that did not belong to her, a detail that would, later, raise many questions. She appeared desperately upset, crying, and shaking her head in distress, a heartbreaking sight. After hanging up, she walked out of the frame toward the open deck. That was the last time anyone ever saw her, and the mystery of her disappearance has, to this day, remained unsolved. The investigation into Rebecca's disappearance was an absolute catastrophe of maritime jurisdiction. Because the ship was registered in the Bahamas, a single police detective from the Bahamas was flown to Mexico to investigate the disappearance of a British citizen on a ship owned by an American company. The detective spent only a few days on board, interviewed a fraction of the crew, and concluded within days that Rebecca had simply been washed overboard by a rogue wave. The Coriam family refused to accept this, and their skepticism was, understandably, rooted in the many unanswered questions. Private investigators discovered that the deck where Rebecca allegedly went overboard was protected by high steel walls, making an accidental fall from a wave virtually impossible. Furthermore, her credit card was used, a staggering detail, miles away from the ship, days after she disappeared, a fact that authorities completely failed to explain. To this day, Rebecca Coriam's fate remains an open wound, a painful reminder of the many questions that still linger. Why do these disappearances keep happening? The answer lies, it seems, within the psychology of the environment and the physics of the ships themselves. Mega cruise ships are towering structures, often rising over 200 feet above the waterline, a height that is truly breathtaking. If a person falls or is pushed from a balcony, the physical impact of hitting the water from that height is catastrophic. Water, at high speeds, ceases to act like a liquid. It acts like concrete, knocking a person unconscious instantly or causing severe internal trauma, a devastating consequence that is, sadly, all too real. When a person goes overboard at night, the ship does not stop instantly. A massive cruise vessel traveling at 20 knots takes up to a mile to come to a complete stop and turn around. By the time the bridge realizes someone is missing, the ship is already miles away. The ocean at night is an absolute abyss of darkness. The wake of the ship's massive propellers creates a violent, swirling vortex of underwater currents that can pull a body down into the depths, trapping it under the vessel or tearing clothing away. If a victim manages to stay afloat, they face the rapid onset of hypothermia in freezing water. Within minutes, the muscles lock up and the individual slips beneath the surface, completely invisible to the naked eye. This reality has led many legal experts to dub the cruise ship the perfect location for a crime. On land, an attacker faces cameras, traffic sensors, cell tower pings, and neighbors. But on a cruise ship, an attacker only needs a few seconds of isolation on a dark balcony. A quick, violent push over a chest-high railing, and the victim is gone into the darkness. By the time anyone notices hours later, the ship is hundreds of miles away. Physical evidence has been subjected to salt air, wind, and rain, and the legal jurisdiction is fragmented across 3 different continents. In recent years, the cruise industry has made efforts to implement technology like man-overboard detection systems using advanced thermal imaging cameras, laser sensors, and radar arrays. However, the adoption of this technology has been frustratingly slow. Cruise lines are not universally mandated by international law to install these expensive systems on older vessels, and many corporations argue that the technology is prone to false alarms caused by sea spray. The chilling story of George Smith, Rebecca Coriam, and hundreds of others serves as a grim reminder of the thin line between civilization and the wild. When we step onto a luxury cruise ship, we carry our modern expectations of safety, law, and justice with us. We see the smiling faces of the crew, the pristine white paint of the hull, and the glittering chandeliers, and we forget that we are floating on top of a 3-mile-deep wilderness that cares nothing for human laws or human lives. We forget that once the shorelines recede and the darkness of the night rolls in, we are surrounded by a profound, unyielding isolation. The families of those who have vanished are left with a unique, agonizing form of grief known as ambiguous loss. There is no funeral, no grave to visit, and no finality. For the Smith family, the question marks remain etched into their lives forever. Did George spend his last moments laughing with friends before an unimaginable, tragic slip of balance? Or did he look into the eyes of individuals he trusted, realizing too late that he was trapped in a room with monsters, fighting for his breath before being cast into the dark, cold Mediterranean? The next time you stand on the deck of a ship at night, watching the black waves crash against the side of the hull, look down at the water. Notice how quickly the foam disappears into the darkness, and how vast the ocean truly is. The bright lights behind you will continue to shine. The music from the lounge will continue to play, and thousands of people will continue to laugh and drink, completely unaware of the abyss just a few feet away. In the floating city, the party never stops, but the sea is always waiting, silent, deep, and perfectly capable of making anyone disappear forever, leaving nothing behind but an echo in the wind and a question that will never be answered.